Just before we begin, if you're looking for full case study packs, mock exams, even free resources, head over to vivatuition.com. You'll find some of the best price SEMA offers on the market, and we've been getting really great feedback from our students on our materials. In our recent August survey, for example, we received an average satisfaction rating of 4.6 out of 5, compared to an average of 3.1 for other tuition providers. You can also subscribe free for access to a case study mini pack and financial ratios document for the November case. And one last thing, all our packs come with a lifetime pass guarantee as standard, so you can find all the details over on our website.
You're very welcome to this pre-scene analysis. With this series of videos, over the next 2.5 hours or so, we're going to go through the pre-scene document for November 2017 with a fine-tooth comb. And we're going to analyse the pre-scene from a number of different perspectives, applying sound business logic and using a number of the theoretical tools you would have come across during your E3, P3 and F3 studies. By the end of this video series, you'll be intimately familiar with the strengths and weaknesses of Steelcast and the key issues that are likely to appear on the day of your exam. So, the November 2017 case study is a very nice one, I think. It focuses on this fictional company of Steelcast, which is a luxury watch manufacturer. All in all, we'll see that this is a company with a lot going for it. Steelcast has a fantastic brand that has been built up over more than a century. That's not something that you can erode overnight as a competitor. They have an ability to charge premium prices, very, very premium prices in fact, and they have little to worry about from their direct competitors. Also, their financial performance is very solid indeed for a mature company, and there are no real worries about liquidity or solvency. Having said that, there are a couple of causes for concern. There are some signs of complacency throughout this pre-scene, and I think there is an overly conservative culture that could make the company vulnerable to any upcoming big market shocks. As well as that, there has been a weak share price performance over the last 5 years, and there are a couple of indications that the future might not be as rosy for the company, and that they may need to reorientate their strategic focus if they're to do as well as they have in the past. So, with this series of videos, we're going to break them into 5 videos. The first video will look at your role as a senior manager at Steelcast and what that implies, how it differs to the management level, the operational level, the kinds of demands that are likely to be placed on you by the board of directors. We'll also look at the company background, the manufacturing process, and retailing in this first video. The second video will focus on the mission statement of the company, the industry background, Steelcast strategy, and then the board of directors and the committees that have been set up to manage risk, etc. Then we'll focus on the financial statements for Steelcast and the financial statements of one of Steelcast's main rivals, Lane. Then in the penultimate video of this series, we'll be taking a look at the risk report, the corporate social responsibility report, the share price, and some press articles, before we wrap things up with a fifth and final video that summarizes the key issues that we've seen throughout the entire pre-scene. Okay then, let's start with your role at this company and a little bit of information about where Steelcast is situated and what that means in terms of the currency they have, etc. Okay, you're a senior manager in the finance function at Steelcast. We're told that you report directly to the board and you advise on special projects and strategic matters. Steelcast, we're told, is based in Highland, where the currency is the H dollar. And companies in Ireland are required to prepare financial statements in accordance with international financial reporting standards. Okay, short and sweet, this introductory section, but there are a few points to make. First of all, you're a senior manager. This is the strategic level, and at this level, you are expected to adopt a long-term focus. It's all about the long-term strategy for a company. And you are going to be interacting with people who are very high up the food chain. Indeed, the board of directors, you can't go much higher. So your people and leadership skills are being called far more into the equation here than they were at management and operational level, where the emphasis was more on technical skills and executing strategy. You were involved in the day-to-day business. Now you're taking the long-term focus. You're advising the senior leaders on that, and you're going to have to be able to influence them. So keep in mind, the audience you're going to be dealing with are senior leaders, and you can expect to be interacting with a range of colleagues from finance to marketing to HR, etc. Whereas at operational and management level, you are dealing more with finance colleagues. That also has implications for the way you word your responses. It's okay at the operational level if you're being asked for something by a finance colleague to then respond and assume that they understand technical financial terms. If, however, at this level you're dealing with a marketing colleague, for example, and there is some financial term you want to use, you would be expected to unpack that term a little bit and explain it. You can't assume that the people you will be interacting with at this level have a lot of financial jargon down. Also, you're expected very much so at this level to understand the full context in which your business operates. That means you have to be well aware of the industry trends, and it's really important that you study the industry in depth at this level especially, and you will be expected to take into account key stakeholders, the wider community, government bodies, etc., and think about the impact that the business has on wider society. It's going to be key to consider the strategic options at this level. Certainly, when you think about your E3 studies, it's going to be paramount that you are able to recommend the right strategic choices for this company. Also, you're going to have to weigh up the risks associated with those strategic decisions, and that links to your P3 studies. And F3 then, it's all about adequate long-term funding and the right financial strategy. So there are three areas that are key for this particular case study. The fact that Steelcast is based in Highland, we know very, very little about Highland. There's nothing, in fact, mentioned about the socioeconomic status of the inhabitants of Highland. That matters less because Steelcast is an internationally focused company. They sell into a variety of markets. They're not just concentrating on their home market of Highland. But the fact that they're dealing with the H dollar and they may be buying or selling in other currencies, and there is an exchange rate issue there. We wonder whether this company is hedging their exposure to other currencies. That deals with your F3 studies and dealing with exchange rate risk. There's mention of that actually in the risk register later on in the pre-scene, but actually Steelcast doesn't seem to be doing much about it. They don't seem to be implementing many strategies to hedge for this risk, even though they're aware that the risk exists. So certainly that's something to keep an eye out for. Okay, the company background then tells us that Steelcast manufactures mechanical watches for the luxury market. So we're talking about clockwork movements to track the time, and these are referred to as wrist chronometers to reflect the fact that they tell the time very accurately indeed. So the luxury market, we think of brands immediately like Rolex is the one that really jumps to mind. And we know that luxury watches are often manufactured in Switzerland. Switzerland is particularly famous for its luxury watches. Many of the biggest luxury watch brands in the world are based in Switzerland. So there is nothing really to imply that Highland is anything like Switzerland, because as I said before, we know very, very little about Highland. What we do know about Switzerland is that it is a high cost economy. Certainly wages are very, very high there. Consumers have a lot of spending power in that particular market, and the Swiss franc has been strengthening in recent times, which has actually hurt some of the luxury watch manufacturers. That may come into play. Already I've talked about the H dollar. How strong or weak that is against other currencies will have a bearing on how well Steelcast might actually do. The luxury market, we're talking about customers who are not at all price sensitive. In fact, the higher the price, it might actually be in favor of the company raising prices far beyond inflation, because it's a signal. It's something that implies quality and luxury and excess, and these customers may be very, very happy to pay absolutely premium prices. A little bit then about the history of Steelcast. It was established over 120 years ago by John Mendel. And the watchmaker, he served his apprenticeship with the largest watchmaker in Highlands East City, and Steelcast is still based in East City, in fact. And he learned his craft, opened his own shop, which dealt with the servicing, repair, and manufacture of watches. And the business has changed very little really since then. They're still the main activities of this company. They're still manufacturing watches, and they're involved in the servicing and repair of these watches as well. So over time, John Mendel built up a reputation for producing reliable and accurate watches, and the company grew. In 1910, it was incorporated as Steelcast, and by 1920, the watches were certified as chronometers because of their great accuracy. They became very, very popular with sailors and pilots at the time. The ability to tell the time precisely was a very, very important part of navigation back in those times, before the advent of GPS tracking, etc. So this is a company with longevity. Tradition is part of the company's prestige. A lot of these watch manufacturers, the high-end watch manufacturers, are long established. You can't build a brand like these manufacturers have built up over the course of 1 or 2 years. The fact that their manufacturing and brands are rooted in tradition, and that they've demonstrated a track record of success over a century or more, is something that these brands have going for them. Also, the fact that they mention here, the accuracy, this comes up throughout the pre-scene. The fact that Steelcast and their competitors have a reputation for the accuracy and excellence of their timepieces. Well, actually, it's no longer an attribute that grants these companies a competitive advantage. Accuracy is the minimum that people expect from any kind of watch, whether it's a handmade mechanical watch such as the ones produced by Steelcast, or whether they are cheap quartz digital watches. They're all accurate. It's a minimum standard that is expected by all consumers, not just high-end consumers. So it's no longer a differentiator. What is a differentiator? Well, principally, it's all about brand for companies in the high end of the market. It's all about the associations that people have with these brands, and marketing, advertising, and the protection of these brands and their reputations are going to be paramount for these companies. So, Steelcast capitalized on the popularity of the watches amongst the pioneers of aviation by adding certain features that made them popular in other fields of sport. So the first chronograph was developed in 1924, and this meant that additional dials and buttons needed to be added to the watch, and that allowed them to time events. So they had a stopwatch facility, and this added more parts to the watch, and chronographs still are the main sellers for Steelcast, and it means that there are more parts, there is more expense that go into the manufacture of these watches, which in turn justifies a higher price. We'll learn later on in the pre-scene that the prices charged for these watches are a function of the cost of materials and the number of parts that go into these watches. There are about 350 parts going into the Steelcast watches. So they're all working in unison, these 350 parts. They're mechanical marvels, really. They're handmade. That adds, of course, a tremendous amount of expense in the manufacture, which justifies the premium prices that they charge. So the chronographs, we're told, they still account for a very significant proportion of Steelcast's revenues today. And as I mentioned before, these products have mechanical clockwork movements as opposed to being digital timepieces. In the next paragraph, very interestingly, we're told that the luxury watches that are manufactured by Steelcast, they're regarded as amongst the very best in the world. This company is regarded as one of the world's leading luxury brands. We think of Rolex is the one that jumps to mind. When you say luxury watches to anyone, probably the first name that rolls off the tongue is indeed Rolex, which is tremendous brand power. And it's a Swiss company. It's actually a privately owned company, which is different to Steelcast, but there are many parallels. So it's all about the intangibles, reputation, which ties into the brand, the associations that people have. You don't just build up those factors overnight. They take time, and a reputation can be destroyed very, very quickly. So it's key that these companies are able to protect their reputations. Marketing is going to be an absolute key to what they do. When we look at the financial statements later on, there are indications that the advertising costs are significant and that they have been rising in recent times for Steelcast. So prices start at $2,500 and they run to as much as $26,500. So that's pretty much in line with high-end luxury watches. You think of Rolex, they start at around $5,000 and they go all the way up to into the tens of thousands and beyond. And we're told that there's an interesting association with military officers. They often prefer to wear good quality mechanical watches rather than cheap quartz watches that are battery powered, and that makes Steelcast watches very, very popular with these military officers. And in fact, later on we learned that there is a discount offered to military officers. Again, they're trying to form some kind of an attachment and association with the military, and this leads us to believe that this brand is quite conservative and indeed male orientated. That as well is bolstered by the fact that they have an association with sports such as aviation, with sailing as well. Traditionally they are more let's say male oriented sports, and it actually means that they might be missing out on the female market. So maybe that's something they need to look at. And then in the final sections of this particular section, we're told that the watches are deemed to be stylish as well as functional. And there's a thriving collector's market for old Steelcast watches, just as is the case with real life luxury watches like Rolex. There is a big market for second-hand watches that are well cared for. As I said before, after service and repair is going to be a big part as well of what these companies do. So a very, very long product life cycle. These watches last for decades if they're well cared for. And in the very last paragraph, we're told that Steelcast was listed on the Highland Stock Exchange in 1982. So it's been a long time on the stock exchange. The fact that it's a publicly listed company means that there are pros and cons that go with that. With any publicly listed company, there are going to be reputational benefits. It signals to the marketplace that this is a company with its house in order. The financial statements will be audited and made available once a year to the public, or every quarter, in fact, as is most often the case. They're going to have access to more funding. They're not going to be just relying on retained earnings and loans. They have access to equity funding. Now, on the negative side, of course, equity can be more expensive typically than debt funding, for example, because it's not a tax-deductible expense, and the regulations, of course, can be onerous for publicly listed companies. There are high expectations coming from the marketplace. There's a lot of attention on publicly listed companies, and indeed there is pressure from shareholders to hit profit targets, sales targets, etc. In the next section, we see the manufacturing process. And interestingly, Steelcast relies on just a single factory in East City. So they've been there since their inception back in 1896, and just one factory. And what this leads me to believe is that this company is not in a hurry to ramp up production. And you ask, well, why would a company not want to jump at the opportunity to ramp up production? These are probably very profitable products. Why wouldn't they want to sell more of them? Well, with any luxury good, scarcity is going to be an important characteristic. If everyone can have a good, well, then it's not going to be very desirable. There is something to be said for limiting production to keep these products in scarce supply, and this is going to mean that there is a higher perceived value for what is deemed to be scarce and difficult to obtain. On the other hand, the fact that they limit production, that they're just working out of a single factory, and that there are a lower number of units being produced, well, that means the company is potentially missing out on economies of scale. And this means that unit costs will be higher, and invariably they will get passed on to the end consumer. For this company, I have the impression that they are not too concerned about high unit costs, because that actually allows them to justify the higher prices that they charge. And why wouldn't you do that if your consumers are not particularly price sensitive? They're very happy to hand over many thousands of dollars for your products. Well, why would you want to alter that situation? So nowadays, the production of luxury timepieces comes about through a combination of the very latest technology plus the input of highly skilled watchmakers. So it combines automation, plus there is still a place for the input of human laborers. So the latest technology comes in the form of computer numerical control, and this mechanism is punching 53 holes very precisely drilled in a brass base plate. So it drills the holes much faster than a human operative could do. And then the human operatives are stepping in for the final assembly. They're actually they're assembling the final watch, and these final steps are taken by highly skilled watchmakers. And also we're told that each watch is moving through the factory, directed from one workstation to the next by a software package that monitors progress. The factory itself is very large. It employs more than 1,000 people, but in spite of that fact, the factory is a very quiet and peaceful place. So the CNC machines, they're actually housed in soundproof boxes, so they're not interrupting the human workers. And Also, the watchmakers have workbenches and ergonomically designed chairs, and they're well-lit spaces. So we're seeing that this company is looking after its workers. They need to do that because they're highly skilled. We're told later on, one of the big risks is that they're very reliant on these highly skilled watch manufacturers. If they up and leave, they're in trouble. So they need to take care of them. Health and safety of these workers is going to be paramount. And the parts and work in progress is moved around the factory by staff pushing trolleys. And this is interesting because the watchmakers are not pressured to work at a pace dictated by the mechanical production line. So the watchmakers seem to be bottlenecks, but it doesn't seem like the company is all that concerned. They start rushing these highly skilled workers. These workers like to work with peace and quiet, and everything needs to be done, as I said, to keep them happy. And perhaps the company is very concerned about having a nice work atmosphere, and they can live with the fact that the watches are being churned out a little bit more slowly than they otherwise would be. And that also ties in with the first point I made in this section, that limiting production is actually a good thing for these luxury watches. But I have the impression that there is little effort being taken to drive costs down. So there are positives, I think, associated with that, in that you can justify a higher premium price because of the higher costs that you're incurring. But you might be inviting a little bit of inefficiency that maybe is in danger of getting out of hand. Maybe the watchmakers would become too used to a good thing, and they would become a little bit too complacent, a little bit too cozy, and maybe an eye needs to be kept on that. The watches, we're told, depend on the quality of the parts and the precision with which they are assembled. And because of the need for this high quality and the precision, quality management is a big concern for Steelcast. One of the things they need to take care with is to ensure that the case of each watch is absolutely airtight, because that results in a more accurate mechanism then. There are 350 parts going into a typical mechanical watch, and very interestingly, Steelcast is actually making all of them in the factory. And we're told that the reason they do that is because it allows them to ensure high quality and that the very best materials are made. Now, this is interesting. Rather than sourcing parts pre-made from external suppliers, they're actually making the parts themselves. And again, it leads me to believe that they're incurring higher costs than they otherwise could if they were concerned with driving costs down. Tomorrow, if Steelcast wanted to drive down their costs, they could really aggressively attack the costs and get them down very quickly, I think. They could outsource the making of these 350 parts to external specialist suppliers. They don't. They keep them in-house, and again, that adds to the costs, and they're probably thinking, well, big deal, we'll just pass on the costs to our customer, who is not at all price sensitive. Also, the fact that they're producing these parts in-house means that they have one less stakeholder to deal with, one less headache in the form of suppliers. So they do, we are told later on in the pre-scene, of course, need to deal with some suppliers because they need raw materials for the making of these parts. And they do need to deal with suppliers there. But the fact that they're making the parts in-house means that they can actually skip out on dealing with more suppliers than they need to. The selling price, and here we come to a key part of this of the profitability for this company. It's all based on a huge selling price, and it's a function of the materials that go into the case. There are less expensive options and more expensive options. The less expensive options would relate to the stainless steel models with straps made out of either leather or stainless steel. And the most expensive options, unsurprisingly, come with solid gold cases and straps. And Each model differs in terms of features, but chronograph, they tend to be the most expensive, and many of these watches are indeed chronograph, so they have the facility to the stopwatch facility that we talked about earlier, more parts going into the chronograph watches, and that makes them more expensive. So high cost is built into the manufacturing process. The fact that they're producing the parts in-house, they're high quality, rather than relying on specialist manufacturers that could achieve economies of scale producing many parts for many watch manufacturers. They take it in-house and they live with the higher cost of producing these parts themselves. They've got high cost staff. They're expert watchmakers. They're probably it's a profession that isn't particularly prevalent, so they're going to be quite rare and difficult to find and difficult to replace, and they're working quite slowly as well, so all of that contributes to the cost. And the fact as well that there are probably a low number of units being produced, all of that contributes to the overall cost. And as I said before, why would they want to keep costs down or attack them aggressively if the selling price is a function of the cost? They're incentivized in some way to incur a high cost, to justify the high price, and to create an association to the brand as being luxurious and out of the reach of common people. And the final part I want to look at in this very first video relates to retail. They are not engaged in direct selling. Instead, Steelcast is relying on the sale of its watches through independent retailers. The advantage with independent retailers is that they will have local knowledge of their markets, and they know what the consumers in their markets desire and how to best serve those markets. So in that sense, they're a valuable ally. Of course, they're going to be taking a cut from the overall profit margins. So that is the downside of relying on retailers. So there is an opportunity to either vertically integrate some of these retailers into the organization, to Steelcast's organization, or indeed to open some of its own retail stores. It's a possibility, but this is quite, I think, a conservative section of the market, of the watch market, and they have tended to do things the same way for a long, long time. Things have been the same, and that ties into what the brand is about. It's about tradition, it's about longevity, and if this is the way things have always been done, they don't want to make big jumps and changes in their strategies because it doesn't actually match their brand attributes. So the retailers, they're selected on the basis of their ability to display and sell Steelcast watches in a manner consistent with the brand's luxury image. They're high-class jewelers. They're located in the very best locations in city centres and airport duty-free areas. And very interestingly, Steelcast is happy for its watches to be sold alongside those of other luxury watch brands. You might ask yourself, well, why is that the case? Well, it's because they want to create positive brand associations. And later on, we're going to be told that these high-end watch brands, they don't regard the threats as coming from other high-end luxury watch brands. Instead, they think they're competing with substitutes, okay, in the form of tailored suits and other luxury purchases. They want to create positive brand associations, and one way to do so is for Steelcast to be sitting beside your Rolexes, your Patek Philippe's, etc., and that has a knock-on effect in the way that their brand is perceived by these buyers. And these buyers, They're not constrained in terms of their spending power. If today they buy a Rolex, tomorrow they have enough disposable income to turn around and buy a Steelcast. So that needs to be kept in mind. The retailers were told they have to hit certain sales targets if they want to keep selling Steelcast products. So there is an incentive for them to sell as many Steelcast models as they can. The sales staff have to be knowledgeable. They have to take online training courses. They need to be able to deal with the technical questions put to them by the customers. There is an expectation from these demanding customers that there be a personal touch and attentiveness afforded to them that would not be afforded to other customers or with other brands. So customer attention and customer service are very, very important considerations here. And then in the final two paragraphs, we're told about after service. So once the purchase takes place, it doesn't just stop there. There needs to be, these watches need to be cared for and serviced regularly, and the retailer is the first interaction that the customers have, and they want the watches to be adjusted first of all when they purchase them, and they need the watches to be repaired and serviced. They bring them to the retailers for servicing quite regularly. We're told mechanical watches, they need to be serviced regularly if they're to retain their accuracy. And you start to think, why would someone bother spending all of this money on watches that need to be serviced so often after you've spent a fortune on them? And as I said before, there really isn't much of an argument for luxury watches in terms of their functionalities. It's not that they're more accurate or better in terms of their functionalities. It's not the hardware. It's all about the brand. It's all about the association that you want to create and the exclusivity that these brands communicate to others. So they need to be serviced once every 2 years, and the customer returns to the retailer, and the retailer forwards them to Steelcast by courier to have the watches repaired and serviced. The customer pays a fee for this service, and it leads us to ask what percentage of revenues might be being contributed to Steelcast and other companies like this through servicing.